Deep within Kentucky's Appalachian Mountains in 1958 lay a secret so dark it would remain buried for decades. Since the 19th century, the Blackwood family had been established in that isolated region, engaging in a practice that defied not only the laws of society but the very laws of nature itself. This is the disturbing account of generations of consanguineous unions, a story that produced one of the most impactful tales of human genetics ever documented on American soil. A remote 40-acre property was their home, surrounded by dense vegetation and protected by steep escarpments that made access for strangers nearly impossible. The family had developed a self-sufficient system, cultivating their own food and rarely venturing down to the neighboring city of Pine Creek, a community with only 800 inhabitants at the time. One of the last living witnesses of those events, Sarah Jenkins, now 89, describes what many in the region suspected. Maybe twice a year they came to the city to buy what they couldn't produce. Always it was the same man, Augustus Blackwood, with his suspicious eyes and pale skin. He never brought the family with him. With Jeremiah Blackwood, the official records of the Blackwood history begin. He arrived in that region in 1871, fleeing legal problems in Virginia. He was accompanied only by his sister cousin, documents from the time show, who would later become his wife. Together they established what would become a dynasty isolated by their own choice. Marriage between cousins was not uncommon at that time, especially in remote regions, explains Dr. Martin Calloway, a geneticist at Kentucky University who studied the Blackwood case. The problem arises when this pattern repeats for generations, exponentially increasing the risk of recessive genetic conditions manifesting. And that is precisely what happened to the Blackwoods. A closed lineage was maintained by the family for almost 90 years, with weddings occurring exclusively among close relatives, brothers with sisters, parents with daughters, uncles with nieces. A web of relationships was created, one that progressively compromised the genetic code. By 1958, when the story came to light, the family was in its fifth generation of consanguineous unions. The patriarch was Augustus Blackwood, great-grandson of Jeremiah, who controlled a property housing 27 people, all related in a complex and nearby way. It was a severe storm hitting the region in March 1958 that revealed what was happening on the Blackwood property. Part of the isolated road leading to the property was destroyed by a flood, forcing Augustus to seek medical help for injured family members. Dr. William Carter, then Pine Creek's only doctor, was called to accompany Augustus back. What he found there would forever change his perception of human capacity for isolation and the biological consequences of consanguineous unions. "I will never forget that day," Carter wrote in his diary, recovered only in 1982 after his death. Large but decaying was the main house. Other small buildings were scattered throughout the property. To a converted barn, Augustus took me, where I found a young man of about 25 with a broken leg. But that was not what shocked me. It was his appearance, a protruding, significantly retreated jaw, clasped fingers, and evident cognitive difficulty. While treating the injury, sounds from the barns upstairs were noticed by Dr. Carter. Investigation was attempted by Augustus, but the doctor insisted, claiming he needed to check for other injuries. A vision that will haunt me until my last days was how he described what he found on the second floor. 5 individuals, aged by the doctor between 15 and 40 years old, were confined in makeshift rooms. Severe physical deformities were had by all, many unable to speak or understand, some with mobility that was extremely limited. Precarious were the hygiene conditions, although evidence existed that someone was trying to keep them fed and minimally cared for. Check to make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. Genetic secrets that impact the health of all mankind, including yours, can be revealed by the science behind these cases. It is essential to understand how genetics shaped our evolution. Initially, Augustus Blackwood reacted with hostility when confronted, but upon realizing the severity of the situation, he eventually revealed a disturbing story developed over generations. The family believed they were purifying their blood through these unions, according to him, a distorted belief passed down as a family tradition. "My grandfather said that our blood was special, that it should not be mixed with that of strangers," Augustus would have explained to Dr. Carter. "When the first babies were born different, we believed it was just a temporary trial, that the next generations would be stronger. Part of this story is confirmed by county records, though they are scarce. Between 1871 and 1958, only 7 birth certificates were officially registered for the Blackwood family, a number inconsistent with the known size of the family. That many births occurred on the property without any official record was revealed by subsequent investigations, allowing the family to keep its most affected members completely out of public knowledge. Those with the most severe deformities were hidden from society by the Blackwoods through maintaining unregistered births. These individuals never attended schools, never received proper medical attention, and in many cases, never once left the limits of the property throughout their lives. One of the most extreme examples of documented voluntary genetic isolation in modern America is represented by the Blackwood case, explains Dr. Eleanor Whitney, an anthropologist who studied the case in the 1970s. What makes this case particularly unique is that, unlike other isolated communities that occasionally practiced consanguineous marriages by necessity or tradition, the Blackwoods did so systematically and intentionally for almost a century. A significant ethical and legal dilemma was faced by Dr. Carter after the initial discovery. Marriages among close relatives were already prohibited by Kentucky laws at the time, but intervention in isolated communities was complicated, especially considering that many of the adults on the Blackwood property had never been officially recorded as citizens. After 3 days of deliberation, the case was decided to be reported to local authorities by Carter. On April 2, 1958, Sheriff James Monroe, accompanied by 2 deputies, visited the property. An extremely suspicious family with members who had clearly never interacted with strangers is described in the official report. "We found a worrying situation that requires immediate intervention," Monroe wrote in his report. Individuals with obvious medical needs, inappropriate living conditions for those with disabilities, and clear signs of forced isolation of some family members. The removal of 8 individuals from the Blackwood property was led by the authorities' intervention, all with significant physical deformities and varying degrees of cognitive impairment. Initially, they were taken to the Lexington Regional Hospital, where their conditions were assessed by doctors. A series of conditions now recognized as typical of highly endogamous populations were documented by Dr. Howard Phillips, a geneticist who examined members of the Blackwood family in 1958. Polydactyly, extra fingers, syndactyly, fusion of fingers, microcephaly, severe facial anomalies, and multiple mental deficiencies. "What we are seeing here," Phillips wrote in his medical report, "is the manifestation of rare recessive genes that, in populations with greater genetic diversity, would remain dormant. When close relatives have children, the likelihood that both carry the same harmful recessive gene increases dramatically, resulting in the conditions we observed. By the family's younger members, equally disturbing aspects of life on the Blackwood property were revealed. Martha, then 19 years old and one of the few who could communicate clearly, described how the most deformed members were kept separated from the others, living in structures adjacent to the main house. Mom said it was to protect them, Martha explained to social workers. The world out there would be cruel to them, she said, but I think it was more to hide them. Only when I carried food did I see some of them. An unprecedented situation was faced by the authorities when dealing with the Blackwood family. No official documentation was held by most adults removed from the property, no birth certificates, school records, or doctor's visits. Legally, they did not exist. A significant ethical debate was generated by the case. On the one hand, clearly inadequate were the living conditions of those kept isolated. On the other, the family had developed its own care system, however rudimentary, and for individuals who had never known another reality, external intervention represented a traumatic rupture. A flaw in our social system was exposed by the discovery of the Blackwoods, says Dr. Richard Branson, a medical ethics expert who analyzed the case decades later. We assume as a society that certain practices are universally avoided. But that in sufficient isolation, communities may develop radically different norms with devastating consequences has been shown by this case. The complex family structure of the Blackwoods was mapped by the authorities during the weeks that followed the initial intervention. Augustus, then 47, was simultaneously the cousin and half-brother of his wife, Eliza. Of the 9 children they had together, 3 had severe deformities and had been kept in the adapted barn. That this practice of separation had begun 2 generations before was revealed by the investigation, when the first obvious signs of genetic problems began to appear. Initially kept as part of the family were these individuals, but as deformities became more pronounced in subsequent generations, the practice of isolating them was adopted by the family. By Robert Blackwood, Augustus's cousin and one of the few family members who occasionally left the property to work seasonally on neighboring farms, a disturbing witness was provided. It started with my grandfather saying that the family's blood was special, that we should keep our lineage pure. When the babies began to be born different, he said it was a test of our faith, that eventually perfect children would be born. So we continued. A kind of family religion had become this distorted belief, with the patriarch of each generation reinforcing the need to maintain the purity of the lineage despite the growing evidence of damage caused. Criminal accusations against the family's adults were initially considered by District Prosecutor Richard Thornton, but the situation had significant legal complexities. Many of the practices had begun in previous generations when laws were less clear, and there was no evidence of intentional cruelty, only of extreme ignorance and isolation. Another complicating factor was media attention. When the first reports began to circulate, journalists from all over the country converged on Pine Creek. The imagination of the American audience was captured by the story of the Blackwoods, with its disturbing elements of isolation, consanguineous unions, and hidden family members. If you've heard about our history, stop a moment and think about the human suffering behind the sensational headlines. Real people are these, whose lives were shaped by terrible decisions they did not choose. To show that you understand the seriousness of this case, leave a comment with the phrase genetics. On April 15, 1958, the first detailed article on the case was published by the Louisville Courier-Journal under the title "Isolated Family Reveals Dark Genetic Secrets in the Kentucky Mountains." The first public analysis of the case's scientific implications was brought by the article, although sensationalist in some respects. A dramatic demonstration of the dangers of repeated consanguineous unions is what we see in the Blackwood case. Dr. James Richardson, a geneticist at the University of Louisville, explained to the reporter. The concentration of shared genes is increased by each generation and, consequently, the likelihood that harmful recessive conditions manifest. Photographs of the property were included in the article, but not of family members, by court decision. Immediate was the impact, even so. Letters began to reach the newspaper, some expressing compassion, some horror, and some disturbingly showing a morbid fascination with the case. The difficult transition they faced was documented by Mary Sullivan, a social worker designated to work with the younger members of the family. They are simultaneously traumatized by the separation from their family and dazzled by a world they could barely conceive of. Elizabeth, 12, had never seen a television before and believed that people inside were real, just very small. Between medical institutions and temporary adoptive homes, the 8 individuals removed from the property were eventually divided. For those with more severe deformities and significant cognitive impairment, the future was uncertain at a time when care options for people with disabilities were limited. Significant changes in social assistance and surveillance policies in Kentucky's isolated communities were caused by the Blackwood case. In the following weeks, a specific program to identify and monitor families living in extreme isolation in the mountainous regions was implemented by the state's Social Services Department. Another situation like the Blackwoods to develop without intervention we cannot allow, said Kentucky Governor A.B. Chandler at a press conference in May 1958. People's rights to live according to their traditions we respect, but not when these practices result in clear damage to vulnerable individuals. To cover the costs of care and assistance for family members now under government protection, the Blackwood property was partially expropriated by the state. On a reduced portion of the original land under the authorities' regular supervision, Augustus and some adults from the family were allowed to remain. Considerably varied was the fate of the individuals removed from the property. The 4 with the most severe disabilities were sent to the Pine Meadows State Institute, an institution for people with intellectual and physical disabilities. Mainly basic care with few opportunities for development or integration was offered by the institution at the time, although well-meaning. From one type of isolation to another they went, said Dr. Whitney in her study of the case. The difference is that proper medical care and decent living conditions they now received, but they were still separated from mainstream society. For the younger ones and those with less severe disabilities, integration attempts were made. Martha and Elizabeth Blackwood, for example, were placed in a foster home in Lexington and eventually managed to attend a special school. Remarkable intelligence was demonstrated by Martha despite limited education, and she eventually became an important voice in raising awareness of the dangers of consanguinity. In a rare interview granted in 1978 at the age of 39, her experience was reflected on by Martha. That our way of life was normal. I grew up believing that the outside world was the strange and dangerous one. Painful but necessary was the transition. That what happened in our family was the result of ignorance and isolation, not evil, I understand today. The object of study at universities across the country became the scientific aspect of the Blackwood case. In 1962, a detailed article in the Journal of Medical Genetics analyzing the inheritance patterns and phenotypic manifestations observed in the family was published by Dr. Phillips. An unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of extreme endogamy on humans is given to us by the Blackwood case, Phillips wrote. Theories about recessive gene expression in isolated populations are confirmed by the observed anomalies and help us better understand genetic inheritance mechanisms. The various conditions observed were thoroughly documented by the article. In addition to polydactyly and syndactyly, cases of cleft lip, cleft palate, microcephaly, prognathism, a protruding maxillary, and a series of skeletal abnormalities. In some individuals, multiple conditions coexisted, creating complex clinical pictures. The high degree of consanguinity was confirmed by blood analyses performed using the techniques available at the time, with serum protein patterns showing significantly larger homozygosity than the general population, a clear marker of endogamy. That deformities had become progressively more severe over the generations was a particularly disturbing aspect of the case, for which evidence existed. A clear pattern of worsening physical anomalies was revealed by recovered photographs from the property showing members of different generations. The cumulative effect of inbreeding depression, the reduction of biological fitness due to increased homozygosity, is what we are watching, Dr. Calloway explained at a 1965 genetics symposium. The likelihood that harmful alleles would manifest in homozygosis was increased by each generation of consanguineous marriages. Significant ethical discussions in the medical community were also prompted by the case. While some researchers saw the Blackwoods primarily as an object of scientific study, others emphasized the human dimension of the tragedy and questioned whether intervention could have occurred earlier. There were signs, said Dr. Carter in his statement. That something was wrong with that family was suspected by people in the city for decades, but their isolation was respected out of tradition. When respect for privacy should give way to concern for well-being is the question this raises. Through both science and society, the legacy of the Blackwoods continues to reverberate 6 to 7 years after the initial discovery. After Augustus's death, the original property was completely abandoned in the 1970s and today is just a collection of vegetation-invaded ruins, a silent memorial to a human tragedy that developed far from the eyes of society. Much of her adult life was devoted by Martha Blackwood to educating people about the dangers of consanguinity. Prior to her death in 2009, a foundation that offers genetic counseling for isolated communities in the Appalachians was helped to be established by her, where genetic knowledge can still be limited. Not just a personal tragedy was what happened to my family, she wrote in her memoirs, published in 1990. A collective failure of education, social assistance, and a system that allowed people to live so marginalized that they could develop such harmful practices without intervention. It was. An even deeper understanding of what happened to the Blackwoods was provided by advances in genetics in the following decades. What scientists of the time only suspected was confirmed by DNA analyses performed in 1992 on some of the survivors. The family's coefficient of inbreeding was among the highest ever documented in human studies, rivaling that of European royalty. That genetic diversity is not just an abstract concept, but a fundamental biological need is what the Blackwood case has taught us, explains Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. When a population, even if it is only a family, is genetically isolated for generations, the consequences are inevitable and often devastating. The way the social assistance system addresses isolated communities was also changed by the history of the Blackwoods. Later adapted by other states with remote rural populations was the Kentucky program created in response to the case, with an emphasis on offering services without unnecessary judgment or interference in traditional lifestyles. The balance between respecting a community's autonomy and ensuring that harmful practices do not occur in isolation is the challenge, explains Robert Thompson, current director of Kentucky's Department of Social Services. That compassionate intervention may be necessary even when not requested was taught to us by the Blackwood case. Beyond the Appalachians, the lessons of the Blackwood case echo. The case is cited by researchers worldwide when studying other isolated populations, from closed religious communities to minority ethnic groups who, for cultural or geographical reasons, practice endogamous marriages. Not only the end result, but the gradual process by which genetic isolation led to the progressive manifestation of hereditary conditions over several generations is what the Blackwood case shows, which makes it so valuable from the scientific point of view, explains Dr. Calloway. Usually preferring to remain anonymous are the few direct descendants of the Blackwoods who know their family history today, fearing the stigma associated with the case. Their surnames have been changed by many and they have integrated completely into mainstream society. Without this story I grew up. A shock it was when I discovered it at 19, shared one of these descendants, who requested anonymity. Immediately, genetic counseling was sought by me and I found that, as my grandfather had married outside the family, not significantly greater than that of the general population is my risk of carrying harmful genetic conditions. A powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and ignorance about basic principles of genetics remains the Blackwood case. How distorted beliefs can be perpetuated in closed communities is also highlighted by it, leading to practices that, seen from the outside, seem clearly harmful, but from within can be perceived as traditions to be preserved. With the Blackwoods, the story does not end, concludes Dr. Reynolds. Even today, in various parts of the world, there are communities where marriage between close relatives is common, either by cultural tradition, geographical isolation, or lack of knowledge about the associated risks. Relevant and necessary remains what we learned from the Blackwoods. Because you liked this story is why you watched this far. I watched here. Leave a comment saying so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Your like be sure to leave and share this story with others that you believe would be interested in these historical and scientific accounts that reveal little-known aspects of human genetics. And so you don't miss our next investigations into cases that science is still trying to fully understand, remember to subscribe to the channel.